Welcome to the MasterMind Library. I'm Ferdinand, your host, and we're reading from Psycho Cybernetics by Maxwell Maltz. All right, so we are on chapter 13 today. All right, and that chapter is titled How to Turn a Crisis into a Creative Opportunity. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and scroll in our virtual book and get us where we need to be, and then we're going to get started. All right, chapter 13, how to turn a crisis into a creative opportunity. I know a young golfer who holds the all-time course record for his home course, yet has never even placed in a really big tournament. When playing by himself or with friends, or in small tournaments where the stakes are low, his play is flawless. Yet, each time he gets into a big tournament, his game deteriorates. In the language of golfdom, the pressure gets him. Many baseball pitchers have pinpoint control until they find themselves in a situation where the chips are down. Then they choke up, lose all control, and appear to have no ability whatever. On the other hand, many athletes perform better under pressure. The situation itself seems to give them more strength, more power, more finesse. People who come into their own in a crisis. For example, John Thomas, the record-breaking high jumper from Boston University, often performs better in competition than in practice. In February 1960, Thomas set a new world record, clearing 7 feet 1 1/4 inches at the U.S. Indoor Championships. His highest previous jump in practice had been 6 feet 9 1/4 inches. It isn't always the baseball player with the highest batting average. It isn't always the baseball player with the highest batting average who is called upon as a pinch hitter in a tough spot. The manager frequently turns down the man with the highest batting average for a player who is known to come through in the clutch. One salesman may find himself inarticulate in the presence of an important prospect. His skills desert him. Another salesman under the same circumstances may sell over his head. The challenge of the situation brings out abilities he does not ordinarily possess. Many women are charming and gracious when talking with one person or a small informal group, but because tongue-tied, awkward, and dull at a formal dinner, but become tongue-tied, awkward, and dull at a formal dinner or a big social occasion. On the other hand, I know a little lady who comes into her own only under the stimulus of a big occasion. If you had dinner with her alone, you would find her very ordinary. Her features are not particularly attractive. Her personality is somewhat on the drab side, but all this changes when she attends an important party. The stimulus of the occasion awakens and brings to life something within her. Her eyes acquire a new sparkle. Her conversation is witty and charming. Even her facial features seem to undergo a change, and you find yourself thinking of her as a beautiful woman. There are students who do extremely well in day-to-day classwork, but find their minds a blank when taking an examination. There are other students who are ordinary in classwork, but do extremely well on important examinations. The secret of the money player. The difference between all these persons is not some inherent quality that one has and the other hasn't. It is largely a matter of how they learn to react to crisis situations. A crisis is a situation which can either make or break you. If you react properly to the situation, a crisis can give you strength, power, wisdom you do not ordinarily possess. If you react improperly, a crisis can rob you of the skill, control, and ability that you ordinarily have to call upon. The so-called money player in sports, business, or in social activities, the person who comes through in the clutch, who performs better under the stimulus of challenge, is invariably the person who has learned either consciously or unconsciously to react well to crisis situations. In order to perform well in a crisis, we need to one, learn certain skills under conditions where we will not be overmotivated. We need to practice without pressure. Two, we need to learn to react to crisis with an aggressive rather than a defensive attitude, to respond to the challenge in the situation rather than to the menace, to keep our positive goal in mind. Three, we need to learn to evaluate so-called crisis situations in their true perspective, to not make mountains out of molehills or react as if every small challenge were a matter of life or death. One, practice without pressure. Although we may learn fast, we do not learn well under crisis situations. Throw a man who can't swim into water over his head, and the crisis itself may give him the power to swim to safety. He learns fast and manages to swim somehow, but he will never learn to become a championship swimmer. The crude, inept stroke that he has used to rescue himself becomes fixed, and it is difficult for him to learn better ways of swimming. Because of his ineptness, he may perish in a real crisis where he is required to swim a long distance. Dr. Edward C. Tolman, psychologist and expert on animal behavior at the University of California. Dr. Edward C. Tolman, psychologist and expert on animal behavior at the University of California, says that both animals and men form brain maps or cognitive maps of the environment while they are learning. If the motivation is not too intense, if there is not too much of a crisis present in the learning situation, these maps are broad and general. If the animal is over motivated, the cognitive map is narrow and restricted. He learns just one way of solving his problem. In the future, if this one way happens to be blocked, the animal becomes frustrated and fails to discern alternative routes or detours. He develops a one response, cut and dried, preconceived, and tends to lose the ability to react spontaneously to a new situation. He cannot improvise, he can only follow a set plan. Pressure retards learning. Dr. Tolman found that if rats were permitted to learn and practice under non crisis situations, they later performed well in a crisis. For example, if rats were permitted to roam about at will and explore a maze when well fed with plenty to drink, they did not appear to learn anything. Later, however, if the same rats were placed in the maze while hungry, they showed they had learned a great deal by quickly and efficiently going to the goal. Hunger faced these trained rats with a crisis to which they reacted well. Other rats, which were forced to learn the maze under the crisis of hunger and thirst, did not do so well. They were overmotivated, and their brain maps became narrow. The one correct route to the goal became fixated. If this route were blocked, the rats became frustrated and had great difficulty learning a new one. The more intense the crisis situation under which you learn, the less you learn. Professor Jerome S. Brunner of Harvard University trained two groups of rats to solve a maze to get food. One group, which had not eaten for 12 hours, learned the maze in 6 trials. A second group, which had eaten nothing for 36 hours, required 20 more tries. Fire drills teach crisis conduct in non-crisis situation. People react in the same way. Persons who have to learn how to get out of a burning building will normally require 2 or 3 times as long to learn the proper escape route as they would if no fire were present. Some of them do not learn at all. Overmotivation interferes with reasoning processes. The automatic reaction mechanism is jammed by too much conscious effort, trying too hard. Something akin to purpose tremors develops, and the ability to think clearly is lost. The ones who do manage somehow to get out of the building have learned a narrow, fixated response. Put them in a difficult building or change the circumstances slightly, and they react as badly the second time around as the first. But you can take these same people, let them practice a dry run, fire drill when there is no fire. Because there is no menace, there is no excessive negative feedback to interfere with clear thinking or correct doing. They practice filling out of the building calmly, efficiently, and correctly. And they have practiced this a number of times. They can be counted upon to act the same way when an actual fire breaks out. Their muscles, nerves, and brain have memorized a broad, general, flexible map. The attitude of calmness and clear thinking will carry over from practice drill to actual fire. Moreover, they will have learned something about how to get out of any building or cope with any changed circumstances. They are not committed to a rigid response, but will be able to improvise, to react spontaneously to whatever conditions may be present. The moral is obvious for either mice or men. Practice without pressure, and you will learn more efficiently and be able to perform better in a crisis situation. Shadowboxing for stability. Gentleman Jim Corbett made the word shadowboxing popular. When asked how he developed the perfect control and timing for his left jab, which he used to cut John L. Sullivan, the Boston Strong Boy, to ribbons, Corbett replied that he had practiced throwing his left at his own image in the mirror more than 10,000 times in preparation for the bout. Gene Tooney did the same thing. Years before he actually fought Jack Dempsey in the ring, he had fought an imaginary Dempsey more than 100 times in the privacy of his own room. He secured all the films of old Dempsey fights. He watched them until he knew every one of Dempsey's moves. Then he shadowboxed. He would imagine that Dempsey was standing before him. When the imaginary Dempsey would make a certain move, he would practice his counter move. Sir Harry Lauder, the famous Scottish actor and comedian, once admitted that he had practiced a certain routine 10,000 times in private before ever giving the performance publicly. Lauder was, in effect, shadowboxing with an imaginary audience. Billy Graham preached sermons to cypress stumps in a Florida swamp before developing his compelling platform personality with live audiences. Most good public speakers have done the same thing in one way or another. The most common form of shadowboxing for public speakers is to deliver their speech to their own image in the mirror. One man I know lines up 6 or 8 empty chairs, imagines people sitting in them, and practices his speech on the imaginary audience. Easy practice brings better scores. When Ben Hogan was playing tournament golf regularly, he kept a golf club in his bedroom and daily practice in private, swinging the club correctly and without pressure at an imaginary golf ball. When Hogan was on the links, he would go through the correct motions in his imagination before making a shot, then depend upon muscle memory to execute the shot correctly. Some athletes practice in private with as little pressure as possible. They or their coaches refuse to permit the press. They or their coaches refuse to permit the press or witness practice sessions, and even refuse to give out any information concerning their practice for publicity purposes in order to protect themselves from pressure. Everything is arranged to make training and practice as relaxed and pressure free as is humanly possible. The result is that they go into the crisis of actual competition without appearing to have any nerves at all. They become human icicles, immune to pressure, not worrying about how they will perform, but depending upon muscle memory to execute the various motions which they have learned. The technique of shadowboxing, or practice without pressure, is so simple, and the results so striking, that some people are inclined to associate it with some sort of magic. I remember a dowager, for example, who for years had been jittery, felt ill at ease in social situations. After practicing shadowboxing, she wrote me, I must have practiced making a grand entrance in my own empty living room 100 times or more. I walked down the room, shaking hands with innumerable imaginary guests. I smiled and had something friendly to say to each one, actually saying the words out loud. Then I moved about among the guests, chatting here and there. I practiced walking, sitting, talking, gracefully and confidently. I cannot tell you how happy I was, and I might say somewhat surprised at the wonderful time I had at the good ball. I felt relaxed and confident. Several situations came up which I had not anticipated nor practiced, but I found myself ad-libbing them admirably. My husband is sure that you worked some sort of mumbo jumbo on me. Shadowboxing turns on self expression. The word express literally means to push out, to exert, to show force, to show forth. The word inhibit means to choke off, restrict. Self expression is a pushing out, a showing forth of the powers, talents, and abilities of the self. It means turning on your own light and letting it shine. Self expression is a yes response, inhibition is a no response. It chokes off self expression, turns off or dims your light. In shadowboxing, you practice self expression with no inhibiting factors present. You learn the correct moves, you form a mental map, which is retained in memory, a broad, general, flexible map. And then, when you face a crisis where an actual menace or inhibiting factor is present, you have learned to act calmly and correctly. There is a carryover in your muscles, nerves, and brain from practice to the actual situation. Moreover, because your learning has been relaxed and pressure free, you will be able to rise to the occasion, extemporize, improvise, act spontaneously. At the same time, your shadowboxing is building a mental image of yourself, acting correctly and successfully. The memory of the successful image also enables you to perform better. Dry shooting is the secret of good marksmanship. A novice on the pistol range will quite often find that he can hold the gun perfectly still and motionless as long as he is not trying to shoot. When he aims an empty gun at a target, his hand is steady. When the same gun is loaded and he attempts to make a score, purpose tremor sets in. The gun barrel uncontrollably moves up and down, back and forth, in much the same way that your hand tremors when you attempt to thread a needle. See Chapter 11. Almost to a man, all good pistol coaches recommend lots of dry run target shooting to overcome this condition. The marksman calmly and deliberately aims, cocks, and snaps the handgun at a target on the wall. Calmly and deliberately, he pays attention to just how he is holding the gun, whether it is canted or not, whether he is squeezing or jerking the trigger. He learns good habits calmly. There is no purpose tremor because there is no over carefulness, no over anxiety for results. After thousands of such dry runs, the novice will find that he can hold the loaded gun and actually shoot it while maintaining the same mental attitude and going through the same calmness, deliberate physical motions. A friend of mine learned to shoot quail in much the same manner. A good shot on the skeet range, the roar of a quail as it took off, and his anxiety for results or overmotivation caused him to miss almost every time. On his next hunt, after learning about shadowboxing, he carried an empty shotgun the first day. There was no need to get excited because he couldn't shoot anyway. No need for overmotivation when you're carrying an empty gun. He shot some 20 quail that day with the empty gun. By the time he had made his first 6 shots, all anxiety and jitteriness had left him. His companions thought he had lost a few of his buttons, but he redeemed himself the next day when he killed his first 8 birds and got a total of 15 quail out of 17 shots. Shadowboxing helps you hit the ball. Not long ago, I visited a friend of mine one Sunday in a suburb of New York. His 10-year-old son had visions of becoming a big league baseball star. His fielding was adequate, but he couldn't hit. Each time his father threw the ball across the plate, the boy froze up and missed it a foot. I decided to try something. You're so anxious to hit the ball and so afraid you won't. You're so anxious to hit the ball and so afraid you won't that you can't even see it clearly, I said. All that tension and anxiety was interfering with his eyesight and his reflexes. His arm muscles weren't executing the orders from his brain. For the next 10 pitches, I said, don't even try to hit the ball. Don't try at all. Keep your bat on your shoulder, but watch the ball very carefully. Keep your eyes on it from the time it leaves your daddy's hand until it goes by you. Stand easy and loose and just watch the ball go by. After 10 trials of this, I advised him, now for a while, watch the ball go by and keep the bat on your shoulder. But think to yourself, you are going to bring the bat around so it will really hit the ball solidly and dead center. After this, I told him to keep on feeling the same way and to keep watching the ball carefully and to let the bat come around and meet the ball, making no attempt to hit it hard. The boy hit the ball. After a few easy hits like this, he was knocking the ball a country mile, and I had a friend for life. The salesman who practiced not selling. You can use the same technique to hit the ball in selling, teaching, or running a business. A young salesman complained to me that he froze up when calling upon protests. His one big trouble was his inability to properly reply to the prospect's objection. When a prospect raises an objection or criticizes my product, I can't think of a thing to say at the time, he said. Later, I can think of all kinds of good ways to handle the objection. I told him about shadowboxing and about the kid who learned to bat by letting the ball go by with the bat on his shoulder. I pointed out to hit a baseball or to think on your feet requires good reflexes. Your automatic success mechanism must respond appropriately and automatically. Too much tension, too much motivation, too much anxiety for results jams the mechanism. You think of the proper answers later because you're relaxed and the pressure is off. Right now, your trouble is you're not responding quickly and spontaneously to the objections your prospects throw at you. In other words, you're not hitting the ball that the prospects throw. I told him first of all to practice a number of imaginary interviews, actually walking in, introducing himself to a prospect, making his sales pitch, and then imagining every possible objection, no matter how screwballish, and answering it loud. Next, he was to practice with his bat on his shoulder. Next, he was to practice with his bat on his shoulder on an actual live client. He was to go in with an empty gun as far as intents and purposes were concerned. The purpose of the sales interview would not be to sell. He had to resign himself to being satisfied with no order. The purpose of the call would be strictly practice. Bat on the shoulder, empty gun, practice. In his own words, this shadowboxing worked like a miracle. As a young medical student, I used to shadowbox surgical operations on cadavers. This no pressure practice taught me much more than technique. It taught a future surgeon calmness, deliberateness, clear thinking, because he had practiced all these things in a situation that was not do or die, life or death. How to make your nerves work for you. The word crisis comes from a Greek word which means literally decisiveness or point of decision. A crisis is a fork in the road. One fork holds a promise of a better condition, the other of a worse condition. In medicine, the crisis is a turning point where the patient either gets worse or dies, or gets better and lives. Thus, every crisis situation is two pronged. The pitcher who goes in the ninth inning with the score tied and three men on base can become a hero and gain in prestige, or he can become a villain who loses the game. Hugh Casey, who was one of the most successful and the calmest relief pitchers of all time, was once asked what he thought of when he was sent in a game in the middle of a crisis situation. I always think about what I am going to do and what I want to happen, he said, instead of what the batter is going to do or what may happen to me. He said he concentrated on what he wanted to happen, felt that he could make it happen, and that it usually did. This same attitude is another important key to reacting well in any crisis situation. If we can maintain an aggressive attitude, react aggressively instead of negatively to threats and crises, the very situation itself can act as a stimulus to release untapped powers. Several years ago, newspapers carried the story about a giant of a Negro who did what two wrecking trucks and a score of men could not do. He raised the crushed metal cab of a truck up off its pin driver. He ripped out with his bare hands the brake pedal, which had the driver's foot trapped, and he beat out the flames in the floor of the cab with his bare hands. Later, when this giant was found and identified, he turned out not to be a giant at all. Charles Dennis Jones was 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed 220. His explanation for his extraordinary feat: I hate fire. 14 months before, his 8-year-old daughter had burned to death in a fire which had leveled his residence. A man don't know what he can't do. Reader's Digest, October 1952. I know a tall, I know a tall, rather frail man who single-handedly somehow managed to carry an upright piano out of his house, down 3 steps, up over a 4-inch curve, and out to the center of his lawn when his house was on fire. It had required 6 strong men to place the piano in the house. One rather frail man, under the stimulus of excitement and crisis, took it out by himself. 2. Crisis brings power. Neurologist J.A. Hadfield had made an extensive study in the extraordinary powers, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual, which come to the aid of ordinary men and women in times of crisis. How wonderful is the way in which, with quite ordinary folk, power leaps to our aid in any time of emergency, he says. We lead timid lives, shrinking from difficult tasks till perhaps we are forced into them or ourselves determined on them, and immediately we seem to unlock the unseen forces. When we have to face danger, then courage comes. When trial puts a long continued strain upon us, we find ourselves possessed by the power to endure, or when disaster ultimately brings the fall which we so long dreaded, we feel underneath us the strength as of the everlasting arms. Common experience teaches that when great demands are made upon us, if only we fearlessly accept the challenge and confidently expend our strength, every danger or difficulty brings its own strength. As thy days, so shall thy strength be. The secret lies in the attitude of fearlessly accepting the challenge and confidently expanding our strength. This means maintaining an aggressive, a goal directed attitude rather than a defensive, evasive, negative one. No matter what happens, I can handle it or I can see it through rather than I hope nothing happens. Keep your goal in mind. The essence of this aggressive attitude is remaining goal oriented. You keep your own positive goal in mind. You intend to go through the crisis experience to achieve a goal. You keep your original positive goal and do not get sidetracked into secondary ones. The desire to run away, to hide, to avoid by the crisis situation. Or, in the language of William James, your attitude is one of fight instead of one of fear or flight. If you can do this, the crisis situation itself acts as a stimulus, which releases additional power to help you accomplish your goal. Lecky has said that the purpose of emotion is reinforcement or additional strength, rather than to serve as a sign of weakness. He believed that there was only one basic emotion: excitement, and that excitement manifests itself as fear, anger, courage, etc. depending upon our own inner goals at the time, whether we are inwardly organized to conquer a problem, run away from it, or destroy it. The real problem is not to control emotion, but to control the choice of which tendency shall receive emotional reinforcement. Prescott Lecky, Self Consistency, A Journey of Personality, Island Press, New York. If your intention or your attitude goal is to go forward, if it is to make the most of the crisis situation and win out in spite of it, then the excitement of the occasion will reinforce this tendency. It will give you more courage, more strength to go forward. If you lose sight of your original goal and your attitude goal becomes one of running away from the crisis, of seeking to somehow get it past it by evading it, this running away tendency will also be reinforced, and you will experience fear and anxiety. Don't mistake excitement for fear. Many people have made the mistake of habitually interpreting the feeling of excitement as fear and anxiety, and therefore interpreting it as a proof of inadequacy. Any normal person who is intelligent enough to understand the situation becomes excited or nervous just before a crisis situation. Until you direct it toward a goal, this excitement is neither fear, anxiety, courage, confidence, nor anything else other than a stepped up, reinforced supply of emotional steam in your boiler. It is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of additional strength to be used in any way you choose. Jack Dempsey used to get so nervous before a fight. He couldn't shave himself. His excitement was such that he couldn't sit or stand still. He did not, however, interpret this excitement as fear. He did not decide that he should run away because of it. He went forward and used the excitement to put extra dynamite into his blows. Experienced actors know that this feeling of excitement just before a performance is a good token. Many of them deliberately work themselves up emotionally just before going on stage. The good soldier is usually the man who feels excited just before battle. Many people place their bets at racetracks on the basis of which horse appears to be the most nervous just before going to the post. Trainers also know what a horse trainers also know that a horse which becomes nervous or spirited just before a race will perform better than usual. The term spirited is a good one. The excitement that you feel just before a crisis situation is an infusion of spirit and should be so interpreted by you. Not long ago, I met a man on a plane whom I had not seen for several years. In course in the course of conversation, I asked if he still made as many public speeches as he had in the past. Yes, he said. As a matter of fact, he had changed jobs so that he would be able to speak more and now made at least one public speech every day. Knowing his love for public speaking, I commented that it was good that he had this type of work. Yes, he said, in one way it is good, but in another way it is not so good. I don't make as many good speeches as I used to. I speak so often that it has become old hat to me, and I no longer feel that little tingly feeling in the pit of my stomach which tells me that I'm going to do well. Some people become so excited during an important written examination that they are unable to think clearly or even hold a pencil steady in their hands. Other people become so aroused under the same circumstances that they perform over their heads. Their minds work better and clearer than usual. Memory is sharpened. It is not the excitement per se which makes the difference, but how it is used. 3. What is the worst that can possibly happen? Many people have a tendency to magnify out of all proportion the potential penalty or failure which the crisis situation holds. We use our imaginations against ourselves and make mountains out of molehills. Or else we do not use our imaginations at all to see what the situation really holds, but habitually and unthinkingly react as if every simple opportunity or threat were a life or death matter. If you face a real crisis, you need a lot of excitement. The excitement can be used to good advantage in the crisis situation. However, if you overestimate the danger or difficulty, if you react to information that is faulty, distorted, or unrealistic, You are likely to call up much more excitement than the occasion calls for, because the real threat is much less than you have estimated. All this excitement cannot be used appropriately. It cannot be gotten rid of through creative action. Therefore, it remains inside you, bottled up as the jitters. A big excess of emotional excitement can harm rather than help performance, simply because it is inappropriate. Philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell tells of a technique which he used on himself to good advantage in toning down excessive excitement. When some misfortune threatens, consider seriously and deliberately what is the very worst that could possibly happen. Having looked this possible misfortune in the face, give yourself sound reason for thinking that after all, it would be no such terrible disaster. Such reasons always exist, since at the worst, nothing that happens to oneself has any cosmic importance. When you have looked for some time steadily at the worst possibility and have said to yourself with real conviction, well, after all, that would not matter so very much, you will find that your worry diminishes to a quite extraordinary extent. It may be necessary to repeat the process a few times, but in the end, if you have shirked nothing in facing the worst possible issue, you will find that your worry disappears altogether and is replaced by a kind of exhilaration. Bertrand Russell, The Conquest of Happiness, Liver Right Publishing Company, New York. All right. How Carlyle found courage. Carlyle has testified how the same method changed his outlook from an everlasting no to an everlasting yeah. He was in a period of deep spiritual despair. My lodestars were bloated out. In that canopy of grim fire shone no star. The universe was one huge, dead, immeasurable steam engine, rolling on, in its dead indifference, to grind me limb from limb. Then, in the midst of this spiritual bankruptcy, came a new way of life. And I asked myself, what art thou afraid of? Wherefore, like a coward, dost thou forever pip and whimper, and go cowering and trembling? Despicable bite! What is the sum total of the worst that lies before thee? Death? Well, death. And say, the pangs of Tophet too, and all that the devil and man may, will or can do against thee. Hast thou not a heart? Canst thou not suffer whatso it be? And as a child of freedom, though outcast, trample Tophet itself under thy feet, while it consumes thee. Let it come, then, and I will meet thee. I will meet and defy it. And as I so thought, there rushed like a steam of fire over my whole soul, and I shook base fear away from me forever. I was strong, of unknown strength, a spirit, almost a god. Ever from that time, the temper of my misery was changed. Not fear or whining sorrow was it, but indignation and grim fire-eyed defiance. The Carlyle, Sartor, Resartus. Russell and Carlyle are telling us how we can maintain an aggressive, goal directed, self determining attitude even in the presence of very real and serious threats and danger. Mountain climbing over molehills. Most of us, however, allow ourselves to be thrown off course by very minor or even imaginary threats, which we insist upon interpreting as life or death, or do or die situations. Someone has said that the greatest cause of ulcers is mountain climbing over molehills. A salesman calling upon an important prospect may act as if it were a matter of life or death. A debutante facing her first ball may act as if she were going on trial for her life. Many people going to be interviewed about a job act as if they were scared to death, and so on. Perhaps this life or death feeling that many people experience in any sort of crisis situation is a heritage from our dim and distant past, when failure to primitive man usually was synonymous with death. Regardless of its origin, however, Experience of numerous patients has shown that it can be cured by calmly and rationally analyzing the situation. Ask yourself, what is the worst that can possibly happen if I fail? Rather than responding automatically, blindly, and irrationally. What have you got to lose? Close scrutiny will show that most of these everyday so called crisis situations are not life or death matters at all, but opportunities to either advance or stay where you are. For example, what is the worst that can happen to the salesman? He will either get an order and come out better off than he was, or he will not get the order and be no worse off than before he made the call. The applicant will either get the job or not get the job or not get it. If he fails to get it, he will be in the same position as before he asked. About the worst that could happen to the debutante is that she will remain as she was before the ball, relatively unknown, and create no great stir in social circles. Few people realize just how potent such a simple change of attitude can be. One salesman I know doubled his income after he was able to change his attitude from a scary, panicky, everything depends upon this outlook to the attitude. I have everything to gain and nothing to lose. Walter Pigeon, the actor, has told how his first public performance was a complete flop. He was literally scared to death. However, between acts, he reasoned with himself that he had already failed. Therefore, he had nothing to lose. That if he gave up acting altogether, he would be a complete failure as an actor. And therefore, he really had nothing to worry about by going back on. He went out in the second act, relaxed and confident, and made a big hit. Remember, above all, that the key to any crisis situation is you. Practice and learn the simple techniques of this chapter, and you, like hundreds of others before you, can learn to make crisis work for you by making a crisis a creative opportunity. And that concludes chapter 13, how to turn a crisis into a creative opportunity. I think one of the things that stood out for me a lot in this chapter was about the rats or the mice who, unless they were hungry, they wouldn't actually like learn the maze very well. But the ones who were hungry, they learned the maze very, very quickly, right? So the crisis brought out something special out of them being hungry. And I think that's very powerful for us in the moves that we make in life. Sometimes we gotta have a little bit of skin in the game. That's what my dad says. He says, "Hey, son, listen, if you're dealing with somebody, doing business with somebody, they got to have some skin in the game or you're going to have a problem." Right. And I think that that's what's being described here. But the skin in the game is about us, it's about our individual walk. Right. So there's some other nuggets in this chapter. Y'all already know I got to take my daughter to school. So what I will say is this: y'all be blessed. And tomorrow, 8 a.m., we're going to dive into chapter 14, which is titled How to Get That Winning Feeling. These chapters, I'm telling you right now, every book that I'm going to read, one of the greatest things you could do is play these recordings for your children. This information right here, if a child learns this early, right, they will learn some techniques and strategies that when they're older, they won't depart from. What does the Bible say? Raise up a child in the way that they should go, and when they're older, they won't depart. This is the kind of information that you want a child to have. This is not something that you want to wait to learn when you are in a really good psychology class in high school or college. You finally reading Psycho Cybernetics for the first time. No, you want a child to read this early so they can have these tools and they can learn how to maneuver and operate within these tools. So yeah, I gotta go. Gotta take my daughter to school. Chapter 14 tomorrow, 8 a.m. Can't wait to see y'all. All right, y'all take care. Be blessed.